In the mountain canton of Glarus, Switzerland, the year 1782 should have been like any other. The age of enlightenment had been sweeping across Europe for decades, bringing with it ideals of reason, human dignity, and justice. Voltaire championed tolerance, Rousseau wrote of natural rights, and across the Atlantic, a new nation was being founded on principles of equality. Yet in this remote Swiss valley, ancient fears and medieval superstitions still held sway over the minds of men. Anna Göldi had no idea that she would soon become the last person in Europe to be legally executed for witchcraft. She was not a sorceress or a practitioner of dark arts. She was simply a servant, a single mother trying to survive in a world that showed little mercy to women of her station. Born around 1734 into crushing poverty, Anna had spent her entire life navigating the treacherous waters of 18th century society, where a woman's worth was measured by her compliance and silence. The household of Dr. Jakob Tschudi seemed to offer Anna a chance at stability. Dr. Tschudi was a respected physician in Glarus, a man of education and standing, who moved in the highest circles of local society. His wife presided over their domestic realm with the authority that came from social position, while their young daughter represented the family's future and honor. Into this carefully ordered world came Anna, carrying the invisible burdens of her class and gender, unaware that her very presence would soon be perceived as a deadly threat. The first signs of trouble emerged innocently enough. The Tschudi daughter began experiencing strange episodes, fits and convulsions that defied the primitive medical knowledge of the time. In an era when mental health was poorly understood and medicine was still steeped in superstition, such symptoms often triggered desperate searches for supernatural explanations. What began as a family's genuine concern for their child's welfare would soon spiral into accusations that would cost Anna her life. The symptoms, likely neurological or psychological in nature, became the foundation for claims of witchcraft and malevolent influence. When Dr. Tschudi discovered needles in his daughter's meals, the household's anxiety transformed into something far more dangerous. In the superstitious mindset of the time, these needles were not seen as potential accidents or pranks, but as evidence of magical persecution. The fact that Anna, as a servant, had access to the family's food made her an obvious suspect. What might have been investigated as a simple domestic mystery in our modern world became, in 1782 Glarus, proof of supernatural malevolence. The needles, whether placed by Anna or someone else, or perhaps even imagined in the hysteria that was building, sealed her fate. The household that had once provided her with employment and shelter now became the stage for her destruction. The accusations against Anna followed patterns established by centuries of witch persecution across Europe. She was accused of using maleficium, harmful magic, to torment the Tschudi child. The specific claims painted her as a woman who had made a pact with dark forces, using her position in the household to work evil against an innocent child. These accusations carried the weight of legal precedent, for though witch trials had become rare in most of Europe, the legal framework for prosecuting such cases remained intact in conservative Glarus. The authorities, rather than questioning the validity of such medieval charges, embraced them as explanations for events they could not otherwise understand. The rational thinking that was transforming the rest of Europe had barely penetrated the isolated mountain community of Glarus, where old fears and traditional authorities still held absolute sway. The Protestant leadership of the canton, deeply conservative and suspicious of change, clung to ancient ways with desperate fervor. Anna found herself trapped in a nightmare that combined the worst aspects of legal persecution with the complete absence of any meaningful defense. As a poor woman, she could not afford legal representation. As a servant, she had no social standing to challenge her accusers. As a single mother, she was already viewed with suspicion by a society that demanded moral conformity from its women. Every aspect of her identity made her vulnerable to the charges now being leveled against her. The trial that followed was a travesty of justice that would have been shocking even by the standards of earlier witch persecution. Anna was subjected to interrogation that bordered on torture, pressured to confess to crimes that existed only in the fevered imaginations of her accusers. The judges, rather than approaching the case with the skepticism that Enlightenment thinking demanded, instead sought to extract admissions of guilt through psychological pressure and the threat of physical torment. The proceedings were conducted in an atmosphere of predetermined guilt, where Anna's denials were seen as further evidence of her supernatural abilities and dedication to evil. The legal system that should have protected her instead became the instrument of her destruction. Confession was considered the highest form of evidence, regardless of how it was obtained. Supernatural explanations were accepted without question when they supported predetermined conclusions. The burden of proof was reversed, requiring Anna to prove her innocence rather than requiring prosecutors to establish her guilt. Under the relentless pressure of her interrogators, Anna eventually confessed to practicing witchcraft. This confession, extracted through coercion and the promise that cooperation might save her life, was exactly what the authorities needed to justify their predetermined verdict. Her words, speaking of supernatural powers she had never possessed and crimes she had never committed, were recorded with satisfaction by men who preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. The confession became the legal foundation for a sentence that had likely been decided from the moment the first accusations were made. The death sentence pronounced upon Anna Göldi was justified by laws that had their roots in medieval Europe, when belief in supernatural evil was universal and unquestioned. The judges cited biblical passages and legal precedents that stretched back centuries, wrapping their decision in the authority of tradition and divine command. They spoke of protecting the community from supernatural threat and upholding God's law against the forces of darkness. What they could not acknowledge, even to themselves, was that they were about to murder a woman whose greatest crime was being vulnerable, in a world that showed no mercy to those without power. The role of gender in Anna's persecution cannot be understated. The vast majority of witch persecution victims throughout European history were women, reflecting deep-seated fears about female power and autonomy. Anna's position as a servant in the Tschudi household placed her at the intersection of multiple vulnerabilities. She was female, poor, unmarried, and dependent on the goodwill of employers who ultimately betrayed her. Her execution would represent not just the elimination of a supposed supernatural threat, but the assertion of patriarchal control over a woman who had, in some undefined way, overstepped acceptable boundaries. Dr. Tschudi's role in Anna's persecution reveals the particular dangers faced by women who worked in close proximity to men of higher social standing. Whether the physician was motivated by genuine belief in supernatural persecution or by more personal concerns about his reputation and household, his willingness to support accusations against Anna demonstrated how easily a woman's life could be sacrificed to protect male authority. The fact that a man of education and social standing could embrace such medieval thinking shows how fragile Enlightenment progress really was when personal interests were at stake. The same rational methods that Dr. Tschudi applied to his medical practice were abandoned when it came to protecting his family's reputation and social position. The psychological dynamics that led to Anna's execution reflected broader patterns of scapegoating and community hysteria. When confronted with mysterious events they could not explain, the residents of Glarus sought someone to blame, someone whose elimination would restore their sense of control and understanding. Anna, as an outsider and a woman of low status, became the perfect target for collective anxiety and fear. Her execution would serve as a ritual cleansing that allowed the community to believe they had identified and eliminated the source of their troubles. The crowd that would gather to witness her death included many who had known her as a quiet servant, a woman who had worked without complaint in their community. Some may have felt doubt about the charges against her, recognizing the human being beneath the supernatural accusations. As news of Anna's execution spread beyond the quiet valleys of Glarus, the reaction from the broader European intellectual community was swift and damning. Voltaire, the great champion of reason and tolerance, denounced the proceedings as a shameful regression into medieval barbarism. In his correspondence with fellow philosophers, he wrote with characteristic wit and venom about the Swiss authorities who had chosen superstition over enlightenment, fear over reason. The execution, he argued, represented everything that the age of reason was supposed to have left behind. The contradiction was stark and deeply troubling. Here was Europe in 1782, a continent where scientific revolution had already transformed understanding of the natural world. Isaac Newton's laws had explained the movement of planets, while advances in medicine and anatomy had begun to demystify the human body. Yet in a small Swiss canton, educated men still believed that a poor servant woman could command supernatural forces to torment a child through needles hidden in food. The cognitive dissonance was profound, revealing how unevenly the light of enlightenment had spread across European society. The case became a cause célèbre among progressive thinkers, who saw in Anna's death a perfect example of what happened when traditional authority structures resisted rational inquiry. They pointed out that the same evidence used to condemn Anna could have been examined through a scientific lens. The child's symptoms, rather than being attributed to witchcraft, might have been investigated as a medical condition. The needles in the food could have been traced to their actual source through careful investigation rather than supernatural speculation. Instead, the authorities had chosen the path of least intellectual resistance, falling back on explanations that required no actual thinking or investigation. The Swiss authorities, however, remained largely unmoved by external criticism. They had acted according to their understanding of divine law and legal precedent, and they saw no reason to apologize for protecting their community from what they genuinely believed to be supernatural evil. This defensive stance revealed another troubling aspect of Anna's persecution: how easily people could convince themselves that obvious injustice was actually righteous action. The psychological mechanisms that allowed educated men to participate in judicial murder were the same ones that had sustained centuries of witch persecution across Europe. What made Anna's case particularly tragic was how preventable it had been. By 1782, there were numerous precedents for European authorities rejecting supernatural accusations and seeking natural explanations for mysterious events. The intellectual tools for understanding Anna's innocence already existed, but they were not applied because doing so would have required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the fragility of social order and the arbitrariness of power. It was easier to execute a servant woman than to confront the possibility that the respected Dr. Tschudi might have been mistaken, or that the community's fears were based on nothing more substantial than collective hysteria. The religious dimension of Anna's persecution added another layer of complexity to an already tragic situation. The Protestant authorities of Glarus believed they were acting in accordance with biblical commands to not suffer a witch to live. They saw themselves as instruments of divine justice, carrying out God's will against the forces of evil. This religious conviction made them particularly resistant to rational arguments about Anna's innocence, since questioning the validity of witchcraft accusations might seem to question divine authority itself. The fusion of religious certainty with legal power created a deadly combination that proved immune to appeals based on evidence or reason. The gender dynamics that had shaped Anna's persecution reflected broader patterns of women's vulnerability in 18th century society. As a single mother, she challenged conventional notions of female respectability and proper social order. As a servant, she occupied a position that required her to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable, present in the most intimate spaces of her employers' lives, yet expected to remain silent about what she observed. These contradictions created a perfect storm of suspicion and resentment that could easily be channeled into supernatural accusations when circumstances demanded a scapegoat. The legal proceedings that condemned Anna revealed the profound corruption of justice systems that prioritize confession over evidence and supernatural explanations over rational investigation. Her interrogators were not seeking truth, but confirmation of predetermined conclusions. The psychological pressure applied to extract her confession would be recognized as torture by any modern legal system, yet it was considered standard procedure by the authorities who condemned her. The fact that her confession was accepted as valid evidence despite being obtained through coercion demonstrates how completely the pursuit of justice had been subverted by the pursuit of convenient answers. The aftermath of Anna's execution was marked by a disturbing sense of normalcy. Life in Glarus continued much as before, with little public discussion of what had occurred. The authorities filed their reports, the executioner cleaned his sword, and the community returned to its daily routines. This casual acceptance of judicial murder revealed how thoroughly the dehumanization of Anna had been accomplished. She had been transformed from a woman into a problem, and problems could be solved through elimination without moral consequence. Yet beneath this surface calm, doubts began to emerge. Some observers, influenced by Enlightenment thinking, quietly questioned whether the evidence against Anna had been sufficient to justify her execution. Others wondered whether the mysterious events in the Tschudi household might have natural rather than supernatural explanations. These private doubts, while not voiced publicly, represented the beginning of a gradual shift in thinking that would eventually lead to the recognition of Anna's innocence and the acknowledgement of the injustice done to her. The international reaction to Anna's execution helped ensure that her case would not be forgotten or dismissed as a local matter of little broader significance. Legal scholars and philosophers across Europe used her death as an example of what happened when outdated legal procedures were applied without proper safeguards for the rights of the accused. Her case became part of the broader argument for legal reform and the protection of individual rights against state persecution. In this way, Anna's death, while tragic, contributed to positive changes that would protect future generations from similar injustices. The psychological impact of Anna's persecution on those who participated in it remains largely undocumented, but it likely varied considerably among different individuals. Some may have felt genuine satisfaction at what they believed to be the elimination of a supernatural threat, while others may have harbored private doubts about the justice of the proceedings. The judges, prosecutors, and executioner all had their own psychological defenses for participating in what we now recognize as judicial murder, though the historical record provides little insight into their private thoughts and feelings. The gradual rehabilitation of Anna's reputation began decades after her death and reflected broader changes in European society's understanding of justice, evidence, and human rights. The same rational thinking that had initially been suppressed by fear and prejudice eventually provided the tools for recognizing the injustice of her persecution. Legal reforms abolished the procedures that had made her conviction possible, while scientific advances offered natural explanations for the mysterious events that had triggered the accusations against her. Modern historians have placed Anna's case within the broader context of European witch persecution, recognizing her as the final victim of a phenomenon that had claimed tens of thousands of lives over several centuries. Her execution marked not just the end of her own life, but the end of an era in which supernatural accusations could be used to eliminate inconvenient individuals. The fact that she was the last person legally executed for witchcraft in Europe gives her death a particular historical significance that transcends her individual tragedy. The memorialization of Anna Göldi in modern Switzerland reflects the nation's efforts to acknowledge and learn from its historical injustices. Museums and historical societies have established exhibits about her case, while scholars have produced detailed studies of the legal and social factors that made her persecution possible. These efforts serve not only to honor Anna's memory, but to educate contemporary audiences about the dangers of prejudice, hysteria, and the abuse of judicial power. The parallels between Anna's persecution and modern instances of scapegoating and injustice provide sobering lessons for contemporary society. The same psychological mechanisms that led to her execution, fear of the unknown, the need to blame someone for mysterious events, and the willingness to sacrifice vulnerable individuals to maintain social order, continue to operate in various forms today. Anna's story represents just one thread in the vast tapestry of injustice that has plagued human history, but her death as the last legal witch execution in Europe gives it a unique and chilling significance. When we examine the broader implications of her persecution, we see not just the end of one dark chapter, but a stark reminder of how easily civilized society can regress into barbarism when fear overrides reason. What makes Anna's case particularly haunting is how preventable it was. By 1782, the tools of rational inquiry existed. Scientific method was established. Legal reforms were being implemented across Europe. Yet in this isolated Swiss canton, medieval thinking persisted with deadly consequences. The educated physician Dr. Tschudi, who should have been a voice of reason, instead became an agent of persecution. The judges, who should have demanded evidence, accepted coerced confessions and supernatural claims. The community, which should have protected one of its most vulnerable members, instead participated in her destruction. The parallels to modern injustices are impossible to ignore. Anna's story reveals timeless patterns of scapegoating that continue to manifest in different forms today. The same psychological mechanisms that led to her execution, the need to blame someone for inexplicable events, the willingness to sacrifice vulnerable individuals to maintain social order, the power of collective hysteria to override individual conscience, remain potent forces in contemporary society. Perhaps most tragically, Anna's persecution illustrates how systems of oppression can persist even when the broader society is moving toward progress. While Enlightenment ideals were reshaping European thought, Anna remained trapped in a pocket of medieval thinking where a woman's life could be forfeit based on the fears and prejudices of powerful men. Her gender, her poverty, her status as an unmarried mother, and her position as a servant created a perfect storm of vulnerability that her accusers ruthlessly exploited. The long delay in recognizing Anna's innocence speaks to another troubling pattern in human history: our tendency to rationalize injustice while it serves our purposes, only acknowledging the truth when it no longer threatens our interests. The same authorities who celebrated her execution as divine justice would eventually be seen as perpetrators of judicial murder. But this recognition came too late to save Anna or prevent the trauma inflicted on her child and community. Yet Anna's story also demonstrates the power of historical memory to serve justice across centuries. Though she was denied a voice in life, her case has become a powerful testament to the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of protecting vulnerable populations, and the need for constant vigilance against the abuse of power. Modern Switzerland's efforts to memorialize her case and educate citizens about this historical injustice represent a form of posthumous justice, acknowledgement that cannot restore her life, but can honor her memory and help prevent future tragedies. The evolution of Anna's story from celebrated execution to recognized injustice mirrors humanity's slow, uneven progress toward greater justice and understanding. Her case has become a touchstone for discussions about due process, the presumption of innocence, and the protection of minority rights. Legal scholars continue to study her persecution as an example of how judicial systems can fail catastrophically when they abandon rational procedures in favor of popular prejudices and supernatural beliefs. Anna Göldi's execution marked the end of an era, but her story continues to resonate because the forces that killed her, fear, prejudice, the abuse of power, the scapegoating of the vulnerable, remain active in our world. Her death reminds us that progress is fragile, that civilization's veneer can be thin, and that the price of justice is eternal vigilance. In remembering Anna, we honor not only her individual suffering, but commit ourselves to building a world where such tragedies become truly impossible, where reason triumphs over superstition, where justice protects the vulnerable rather than serving the powerful, and where every human life is recognized as possessing inherent dignity that no authority can justly destroy. The tragic execution of Anna Göldi stands as both an ending and a beginning, the end of Europe's witch-hunting madness, and the beginning of our ongoing struggle to create more just and rational societies. Her legacy challenges us to examine our own prejudices, question our own authorities, and protect our own vulnerable populations. In this way, Anna's voice, silenced by an executioner's sword nearly 2.5 centuries ago, continues to speak across time, demanding that we do better, be better, and ensure that her sacrifice was not in vain.